Hürtgen Forest, Germany, November 1944. 28 pairs of empty combat boots were found in the Hürtgen Forest, perfectly arranged in formation. The soldiers who wore them were never seen again. From the depths of my collection, the War Maestro brings you a tale that will make you question what horrors truly lurk in the darkest corners of military history. The Hürtgen Forest Campaign of 1944 stands as the longest single battle the U.S. Army has ever fought. For 5 bloody months, American forces struggled through 50 square miles of dense German woodland, where towering pines blocked out sunlight and constant artillery fire shattered trees into deadly wooden shrapnel. But among the classified files of the 22nd Infantry Regiment lies a darker story, one that military historians still struggle to explain. November 17th, 1944. The weather report noted heavy fog and temperatures hovering just above freezing. Echo Company received orders to secure a strategic crossroads deep within the forest's interior. A routine mission, or so it seemed. Captain James Harrison, a decorated veteran of the Normandy campaign, assembled his men at 0300 hours, 28 soldiers, each carefully selected for their experience in night operations. The mission briefing was straightforward: maintain radio silence, secure the position before dawn, and await reinforcements. Sergeant Michael Cooper, the company's senior NCO, noted in his field journal that the men seemed unusually tense. Local German civilians had warned of strange occurrences in that sector. Stories of entire patrols vanishing without trace, of voices calling out in the darkness using the names of long-dead soldiers. Harrison dismissed such tales as psychological warfare. The Germans were masters of deception, and fear was their favorite weapon. Yet, he couldn't shake an overwhelming sense of wrongness as Echo Company moved out. The fog seemed almost alive, coiling around their boots like ghostly fingers, muffling even the sound of their breathing. They followed a narrow game trail, guided by compass bearings and hand signals. Private First Class Thomas Walker, bringing up the rear, would later recall how the forest seemed to close in behind them, erasing their path of retreat. The trees pressed closer, their branches intertwining overhead like grasping hands, until the men could barely move without touching bark that felt strangely warm to the touch, almost like flesh. At precisely 0430 hours, the forward operating base received a broken transmission. Through the static and interference, only fragments were clear. There in the trees, not Germans, eating, Jesus Christ there, then silence. The radio operator noted that the transmission ended with what sounded like singing, a low, hollow sound that made him think of wind through empty skulls. The official after-action report would later state that Echo Company had encountered heavy enemy resistance, but the classified addendum, sealed until 1976, told a very different story. A story that began with 28 pairs of boots arranged in perfect formation and ended with a single survivor who would never sleep indoors again.
3 weeks before the incident, a classified memorandum circulated among Allied command. Field reports from the 4th Infantry Division described unusual phenomena within a 5-mile radius of the target crossroads. 8 separate units reported equipment malfunctions, compasses spinning wildly, radio sets picking up transmissions in unknown languages, batteries draining without explanation. More disturbing were the psychological effects. Soldiers reported vivid shared hallucinations, glimpses of figures moving through the trees wearing World War I uniforms, the sound of Civil War-era drums echoing through the fog, the sensation of being watched by something ancient and hungry. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Matthews, the regimental intelligence officer, compiled these accounts with growing concern. His personal notes, discovered decades later in a Pentagon storage facility, revealed a pattern he found deeply troubling. Every incident occurred during periods of heavy fog. Every affected unit reported the same dream the night before: a vast underground chamber filled with empty military uniforms from every era, arranged in endless rows, waiting to be filled. The local German forestry service had their own records. Since the 1800s, they had documented strange disappearances in this particular sector. Hunters would vanish, leaving only their boots behind. Logging crews refused to work there, claiming the trees tasted human fear. In 1917, during the height of World War I, an entire German pioneer company disappeared while constructing defensive positions. They found the engineers' tools laid out in perfect order, but the men were gone. The official report blamed Allied artillery, but the shells they recovered had been fired decades earlier, their brass casings green with impossible age. Captain Harrison received these warnings 48 hours before Echo Company's mission. His commanding officer suggested requesting a different route, one that avoided the area locals called Waldverschlinger, the forest that devours. But Harrison was a practical man who had survived D-Day by trusting facts over folklore. He noted the warnings in his operational plan, but proceeded with the original route. The crossroads had strategic value, and superstition wouldn't change that. The night before deployment, Harrison visited each of his platoons during their final preparation. He found his men unusually quiet, methodically checking and rechecking their equipment. Several admitted to having strange dreams. Sergeant Cooper's last diary entry described how his uniform had felt wrong against his skin, like it was trying to merge with me, become part of my flesh. He scratched out this observation with such force that the pen tore through 3 pages. PFC Walker, during his later debriefing, revealed that he had tried to warn Harrison. While cleaning his rifle that night, he had noticed that the metal seemed to pulse like a living thing, hungry for something more than gun oil. But he stayed silent, fearing the ridicule of his fellow soldiers. Some warnings, he would later reflect from his self-imposed outdoor exile, should never go unspoken.
Echo Company moved through a maze of shattered trees and water-filled craters. The fog had thickened until men could barely see their hands, forcing them to navigate by touch, each soldier keeping contact with the man ahead. The first warning came when Private Martinez reached for his canteen. The metal felt warm, almost alive against his fingers, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. Within moments, every piece of equipment began to change. Their weapons hummed with an unnatural resonance. Dog tags grew hot enough to leave marks on skin. The metal and leather of their gear softened and shifted, transforming into something that defied explanation. Most disturbing were their boots. The leather had become membranous, and the eyelets wept a fluid that smelled of copper and old blood. At 0422 hours, a sound cut through the fog. A low, rhythmic drumming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The men felt it in their bones, in their teeth. Their uniforms began to ripple without wind, the fabric moving like disturbed water. The forest around them had gone completely silent. No birds, no wind, not even the distant artillery fire that had been their constant companion. The trees pressed closer, branches reaching down like fleshless arms, The ground beneath their feet felt wrong, more muscle than earth, tensing and relaxing with each step. Captain Harrison knew they had to move. Whether this was some new German weapon or something else entirely, standing still meant death. As Echo Company pushed forward, PFC Walker glanced back. The fog had taken on a strange density, forming shapes that looked disturbingly like 28 human silhouettes, waiting patiently to be worn. Captain Harrison focused on finding logical explanations. This had to be some advanced German chemical agent, he reasoned. Something designed to incapacitate Allied forces through panic rather than physical harm. The strange sensations, the equipment malfunctions, all of it could be explained by modern warfare technology. But at 0437 hours, rational explanations crumbled. PFC Miller removed his helmet and found the interior webbing transformed into something alive, pulsing with tiny electrical discharges. When he dropped it in shock, the helmet landed with a wet sound and crawled back toward his feet. Sergeant Cooper maintained his military discipline, documenting everything in his field notebook. His final entry was cut short. 0440 hours. Equipment showing signs of life. Uniforms becoming flesh-like. Warning, buttons trying to merge with skin. Note, these may not be my hands writing this. The men were combat veterans, trained for every kind of threat. But nothing had prepared them for their own gear trying to consume them. 3 soldiers reported their dog tags, whispering in voices that sounded like dead relatives. The fog had taken on a reddish tinge, and the air felt thick with anticipation. At E445 hours, Harrison ordered his men to shed all non-essential equipment. But as they reached for buckles and straps, their gear tightened like constricting snakes. Their uniforms clung with terrible intimacy, and the forest seemed to lean closer, eager to witness what would happen next. Echo Company reached the crossroads at 0447 hours and found a sight that shattered any remaining grasp on reality. Suspended in the fog were uniforms from every era of warfare. Roman armor, Napoleonic coats, Wehrmacht Feldgrau, all empty, all moving, as if inhabited by invisible soldiers. The fog itself began to take shape, forming into perfect rows of soldiers without bodies. These apparitions moved with drill field precision, surrounding Echo Company in a silent ceremony of inclusion. Through the mist, the men could see these figures were incomplete, uniforms searching for bodies to fill them. Captain Harrison's attempt to establish a defensive position failed as their weapons transformed beyond use. Rifles twisted like living things. Ammunition pulsed with visible hunger. Combat knives reformed into surgical tools meant for some unspeakable procedure. Staff Sergeant Anderson was the first to understand. His last radio transmission cut through the organic static. They're not possessing our uniforms. Our uniforms are possessing us. The fabric of his jacket had begun to merge with his skin, buttons sinking into flesh like ticks burrowing for blood. His boots fused with his feet, leather and skin becoming one writhing mass. The trees around them wept luminescent sap, casting everything in sickly green light. Echo Company watched their uniforms begin the process that countless others had endured before. The fabric became translucent, revealing impossible networks of vessels and nerves. Their equipment melted and reformed into hybrid horrors, half metal, half flesh, all hunger. PFC Walker, saved only by his ill-fitting uniform, would later describe the sound: 27 men screaming in perfect harmony as their gear began to digest them from the outside in. The forest pulsed with satisfaction, its branches swaying to the rhythm of transformation. The fog thickened to liquid density, filled with shapes that belonged in no natural history. Captain Harrison's final order came through lips that were no longer entirely his own. Second Lieutenant Morris, form the men up for inspection. Echo Company will now join the Eternal Formation. Every soldier knows you never abandon your unit, never flee your position, never leave your gear behind. But as PFC Walker ran through the twisted Hürtgen Forest, his only thought was escaping his uniform before it could consume him. His boots went first, fought off despite their attempts to clench around his feet. The laces whipped like steel cables, slicing deep into his ankles. His helmet tried to fuse with his skull, and he tore it away with patches of scalp still attached. Each piece of discarded equipment screamed in thwarted hunger. The forest itself tried to stop him. Branches reached with deliberate malice, snagging at his remaining clothes. The ground became adhesive, each step a battle of will. Through the fog came Echo Company's voices, now transformed into an inhuman cadence. The sound of men becoming something else, something that had existed since the first warrior donned armor and marched to war. His field jacket proved hardest to escape. The buttons had rooted into his chest, spreading tendrils toward his heart. Walker ripped it open, feeling skin tear, watching in horror as the jacket writhed and tried to reclaim him. His pants constricted like pythons around his legs, the fabric metamorphosing into muscular membrane. The voices of his fellow soldiers called his name with terrible unity. They spoke of painless transformation, of eternal service, of a formation that transcended mere flesh. Walker used his combat knife, the only equipment not yet fully changed, to cut away his remaining clothes. The blade grew hot, trying to bond with his fingers, but he worked faster than it could transform. In the end, he ran naked through enemy territory, his skin mapped with thousands of tiny wounds where his uniform had tried to claim him. He passed German patrols, who seemed blind to his presence, their own uniforms rippling with unsettling familiarity. For 6 hours and 15 miles, he ran without stopping, pursued by a hunger that lived in every scrap of cloth and metal he encountered. Even at the aid station, the medics had to check each bandage carefully before it touched his skin. Some of them, Walker noticed with rising horror, were already beginning to pulse with their own heartbeat. The official investigation into Echo Company closed on December 2, 1944. The unit was listed as missing in action, presumed KIA, and the crossroads vanished from all subsequent military maps. But some stories refused to stay buried, especially those written in flesh and steel. When the files were declassified in 1976, researchers uncovered a pattern military intelligence had tried to suppress. Every November 17th, something stirs in that sector of the Hürtgen Forest. Hunters find military boots arranged in perfect formation, the leather still warm and pulsing. German foresters report American voices calling cadence in the fog, speaking in tongues both ancient and modern. Equipment caches appear, pristine World War II gear laid out for inspection, each piece displaying impossible characteristics under laboratory analysis. PFC Walker lived until 1993, surviving in a hand-built shelter in the Arizona desert. He refused walls or roofs, claiming enclosed spaces felt like uniforms trying to wear him. His VA records describe unique symptoms:
Any manufactured clothing that touched him too long began to change. Buttons would warm to body temperature, seams would pulse like veins, zippers would whisper of eternal service. The medical staff learned to check their own uniforms carefully after each visit, watching for signs that their clothes had started to hunger. Before his death, Walker wrote a final statement revealing what Echo Company had truly discovered: an ancient entity that evolved alongside warfare itself, feeding on the sacred bond between soldiers and their equipment. Through countless battles, it had learned to bridge the gap between organic and inorganic, transforming uniforms and gear into hybrid organisms that consumed their wearers to create eternal soldiers. In 2014, this truth became harder to deny. A NATO training exercise near the old crossroads was suddenly abandoned after thermal imaging revealed 28 identical heat signatures arranged in perfect formation, despite the area being empty. Analysis matched human body temperature, but spectrographic data showed something impossible: a complex fusion of textile fibers, metal alloys, and organic matter that defied classification. The most disturbing detail: the formation was growing. Walker's final warning was found clutched in his hand, written on a piece of untreated bark. They're still out there, still in formation, still recruiting. Every war feeds them. Every uniform strengthens them. Echo Company was just the beginning. Look closely at old battlefields. You'll see them waiting in the shadows of victory monuments. Empty uniforms yearning to be filled, gear hunting for new bodies. The eternal formation never stops growing, never stops hungering, and now they know how to wait. Today, that section of the Hürtgen Forest remains restricted military ground. Officials cite unexploded ordnance, but locals know the truth. On foggy nights, especially in November, they see perfect formations moving through the trees, pristine uniforms, and gleaming equipment, marching with inhuman precision. Military patrols investigate, but they too disappear, leaving only their boots behind, arranged in neat rows as if waiting for inspection. The most recent report, filed by a German forest ranger in 2023, describes finding a clearing where 28 pairs of World War II combat boots stood in formation. As he watched, modern tactical gear began to appear beside each pair: body armor, combat webbing, digital camouflage uniforms, all empty, all waiting. The gear was warm to the touch, and the fabric rippled like muscle under skin. Most disturbing of all, he reported hearing voices from the empty uniforms, speaking in every language of war, promising eternal service to any soldier willing to be worn. Some say, if you visit old battlefields at night, you can see them. Empty uniforms standing at attention, boots polished to an impossible shine, equipment laid out with perfect military precision. They're waiting, always waiting, for new recruits to join the ranks of the eternal formation. After all, every soldier knows, the uniform makes the man. But sometimes, as Echo Company discovered, the uniform unmakes him too. If this tale from the War Maestro Archive haunted your thoughts, take a moment to join our ranks. Check your uniform's buttons. Make sure they're not warm, and subscribe to uncover more dark military histories. Hit that notification bell. You'll want to know when our next classified file opens. Share this story with those who appreciate that sometimes the most chilling tales come directly from the battlefield. Leave a comment below. Have you ever felt your military gear behave strangely? Or perhaps you have your own dark tale from service to share? Remember, some formations are still waiting to be filled.